Welcome everyone to this Reclaim Network webinar series. This is webinar number 16. Just to say that the Reclaim Network Plus is funded by the UKRI. So there are three councils, EPSRC, NERC, and HRC. And we got 5 partners collaborating universities in it. That includes the University of Surrey, where I come from. So my name is Prashant Kumar, and the colleagues come from the UKCH, Bangor, Warwick, Bath. We got over 500 members so far of the network, and that network, is growing. So you could see the link in the chat box in case if you're not a member, so you can register yourself. There's no cost associated with it. Just to say that this is a monthly webinar series which happens every Wednesday between 12:30 and 13:30 p.m. We usually have 2 speakers. Try to have a mix of the colleagues coming from the academic and the non-academic background. So as you can see, the last one was from a colleague from the University of Sao Paulo, and then a colleague actually coming representing another organization, non-academic organization. So these webinars are usually to share the best practices and facilitate knowledge exchange between the practitioners, researchers, and the policymakers. So we are, picking up the speakers which are based on the open invitation. So you could, just fill a form, or you just send an email if you're interested in being one of the speakers. And then there has been some, the invited speakers to basically fill those gaps. So each webinar has 2 speakers. And today we got Dr. Tristan Kershaw from the University of Bath and Professor Fang Wang from Chinese Academy of Sciences. And they both are going to present a very important, the important areas that links to the green and blue infrastructure. So before I introduce the first speaker, Dr. Tristan Kershaw, I would like to make some housekeeping notes. So this webinar is recorded so that it can be made available later on. So you could see the previous webinars, and you will see a link in the chat box. There will be a question answer session, but we will take all these questions and answers towards the end of these 2 presentations. Each of them is expected to be around 20 minutes. So may I request you to use the Q&A box. So you can see a box on your screen which says Q&A. So you can type your questions. You can put your name and the university if you want it to be read with your question itself. My colleague, Professor Dr. Nerea Calvillo is here, and she will be chairing that session, the Q&A session later on. So just to introduce our first speaker today. So we have Dr. Tristan Kershaw. He's a lecturer in climate resilience within the Department of Architecture and Civil Engineering at the University of Bath. A physicist by training, his research now focuses upon the topics of building physics, sustainability, climate change adaptation, and urban heat mitigation. This talk presents some highlights from the recent and ongoing research being carried out by Tristan and his research group into how green and blue spaces can alter the urban microclimate, mitigate the urban heat island, and offset the effects of climate change, making urban areas a healthier place to live. Very interesting talk. So Tristan, over to you.
Right, okay, let's try and share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see the presentation now. So this talk has a very long title, Utilising Green and Blue Infrastructure to Mitigate the Urban Heat Island and Promote Climate Resilience. So I suppose we'll start at the beginning. What do we mean by green and blue infrastructure? So by this, I'm including anything that is essentially vegetation or water within an urban area. So that can take the form of ditches, parks, scrubland, small urban forests, rivers. So quite a broad range, really. So the world is experiencing quite rapid urbanisation. So we've recently passed the 50% point where half the world's population live in cities. The reason for this is that cities are generally considered to be sort of more resource and infrastructure efficient. Lots of people in a smaller area means that hopefully you can make efficiency savings in terms of materials, infrastructure, energy. The downside is when you start putting lots and lots of buildings together, you end up with this urban heat island effect, where cities are typically warmer than their rural surroundings. And what this can lead to, especially in a warming climate, is life-threatening temperatures. And because the heat island itself is a boundary layer effect, which traps air in and around the city, particularly at street level, you end up with accumulation of air pollutants as well. So both of these factors can lead to quite worrying trends in terms of human health and well-being. So why do we really care? So my angle on this is that the magnitude of the urban heat island in even temperate cities is comparable to the expected warming due to climate change this century. So if we can do something about that, we can help offset the effects of climate change and reduce the impact on human life. So I live in the UK. It's quite a cool climate generally. It's quite warm now outside. It's not too warm inside my house here. But we don't tend to get much in the way of heat-related deaths. Most people die in the winter due to cold-related deaths. So what this means is, as a result of climate change, we're going to see potentially a 5-fold increase in the number of heat-related deaths by 2050. So that's going to be an increase from about 2,000 deaths per year at the minute up to, say, 10,000. And most of this is in urban centres. So here's some average urban heat islands for different cities. London, on average, has a heat island of about 7 degrees C between the centre of London and a similar latitude outside. Smaller cities such as Sheffield or Bath might only be a couple of degrees C. So every time you drive into a city centre in your car, have a look at the thermometer and you'll probably see it go up a few degrees as you drive towards the centre, and that is this heat island effect. This heat island is greater during periods of warm, still weather, such as heat waves, which means that during hot weather, this 7 degrees C that you might see in London suddenly becomes 9 or 10 degrees C. So where you may only be getting 30 degrees in rural Surrey, suddenly you're topping 40 in London, and then more and more people will start to die, and the increase will be exponential. Worryingly, we have no UK policy to reduce the urban heat island beyond a simple sentence saying more green space is better. I'm always very dubious of very short policy guidelines, no sort of scientific backup. Is more actually better? Or do we need to think about it a bit more? So if we look at the urban heat island of London and we sort of overlay it over a map, we've got some very big parks in London. London's a very green city. But what we can see from here, the atmospheric heat island effect is not actually affected by most of the parks. We get a slight reduction to the north and east of Richmond Park and Wimbledon Common, which is probably the combined biggest area of green space in London. But we see very little effect from Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens. Lee Valley Park in the top right there seems to have no effect whatsoever. So why do different green spaces have an effect upon the atmospheric cooling while others don't? So what is different about these spaces that we need to take into account, and how can we promote disruption of this boundary layer above the cities, help cool these these urban areas and promote reduction of air pollution. So this is where my research has been focusing for the last few years. So we do a lot of sort of simulations of urban heat islands, atmospheric aerodynamics, and this all hinges around the fact of what the heat island is. It is a boundary layer effect. So when air, wind, moves over a surface, to conserve momentum, the airspeed has to be zero at the ground. Otherwise, we'd have loss of erosion. As the surface becomes rougher, airspeed has to reduce at height as well. And what happens is we get turbulent layers over a rough surface that kind of isolates the air from the atmosphere above. So in the similar way that a golf ball works, they put dimples on golf balls to try and trap air at the surface to help it fly through the air. And companies spend vast amounts of money on simulations to try and make these balls go further and reduce drag. A city traps air in between the buildings and at street level, street canyons, and the air above is kind of isolated. So this urban heat island arises from changes in the surface roughness, and it modifies the convection efficiency of the vertical fluxes above the cityscape. So what that means is that it alters the rate at which your city can lose heat by convection. But also, because the vertical fluxes are affected, also things such as evaporation as well. So warm air and pollutants will collect at street level and is unable to dissipate vertically. Given that cities also tend to be made of concrete and tarmac and other high thermal inertia materials and have a reduced albedo, so they absorb more heat, there's also a nocturnal warming effect when stored heat is given out. So the maximum heat island is typically overnight when air temperatures are at a minimum. So this is particularly troublesome for things like heat waves, where it's quite hard to cool your buildings at night. The hot atmosphere outside means that your buildings don't cool down as quickly either. So this is important. So there's many contributing factors. It's not just the surface roughness, it's also a lack of evapotranspiration from green and blue space. You've also got the anthropogenic heat given off by people, traffic, air conditioning units, pumping out heat from buildings into the outside world. And the canyon effect traps solar radiation at street level, kind of bouncing backwards and forwards between building surfaces. So this limited sky view also contributes to slowed heat loss from urban areas. So how can we kind of mitigate these effects and help cool urban areas? So there are policy documents that will say things like more green space is better, put some lakes in your city that will help cool it through evaporation. These are quite simple terms. They will help cool the air. Evaporating water or transpiration through plants is an endothermic process. It will cool the air around it. But it also leads to increased humidity. And if that humidity, that water vapor, if it can't dissipate vertically through the boundary layer, you're going to lead to increased humidity levels at street level, which will adversely affect human thermal comfort. So your body loses heat by radiation, convection, and evaporation. So if you've got a warm thermal environment from lots of warm building surfaces, you've got a high radiant temperature, so you find it hard to lose heat by radiation. If it's humid, you find it hard to lose heat by evaporation or sweat from your skin as well. So all of these contributing factors prevent humans from regulating their body temperature, and that's when people start to suffer heat stress and heat strain. So there are various things we don't understand at the minute. So what type of green space is best? Should it be an open park? Should it be scrubland, sort of medium-sized bushes in it? Should it be small urban forests? The image I showed of London earlier shows that there's clearly a difference between different sizes, shapes, and type of green space. As to how that relates to the urban area around it is still an ongoing area of research. Other questions include, how does water behave in the urban environment? Do urban lakes stratify like reservoirs? You have to take into account the high thermal inertia of the water, the fact that it's going to increase humidity levels as well. And what about the size, shape, and location? Do we need different guidelines for different styles of city? Whether that's a high-rise city or residential domestic region. So I don't want to scare people off. These areas do actually have benefit. During daylight hours, any form of green space will have photosynthesis. It will absorb solar radiation. Green space tends to have a higher albedo, so it reflects more radiation back out into space as well, reducing surface temperatures. It also produces water vapour, which is less dense than air, and therefore will naturally try and rise away from the urban surface. So you'll have a plume of cooler air rising away from an area of green space during daylight hours. At night, plants tend to respire, same as everything else, and they will stop producing this water vapour, which means that green space might not be as useful as you hope, particularly during heatwave events, because water availability in the ground might also be reduced, which will limit the amount of evapotranspiration. So you may not get the cooling you require when you most need it. So open parks will reduce the surface roughness of the city, which will help disrupt boundary layer. So we're going to reduce the surface roughness, we're going to help disrupt that boundary layer, which will help create more turbulent flux away from the city surface. But currently there's very little information about how, say, trees or small urban forests, clusters of trees, will affect the boundary layer and the urban heat islands beyond sort of shading of surfaces. So solar shading will reduce the radiant temperature, it will reduce accumulated heat. But in terms of the actual boundary layer itself, a tree is also a roughness element, same as a building. So it's very poorly understood how these things will affect the turbulent fluxes of the city. So this is ongoing research. I have a new PhD student who is currently trying to look at all these aspects. We also need to think about cost, really, cost versus benefit. Green space is excellent. This is a picture of Queen Elizabeth Park in London. So it's the largest new park built this century. It's the old Olympic Park. And as you can see, it has a lot of footpaths. It has a variety of different types of vegetation. So it's contributing to the ecosystem services, the biodiversity, it's promoting walkability, good for the mental health of the people that live nearby and can utilise this space. It will also have some cooling effect on the local atmosphere and potentially reduce air pollution through the vertical transport of air. If it's designed properly, which it looks to be, it's going to also reduce surface runoff, help prevent flooding. And so it's going to be quite useful in a variety of ways. However, this is an up-and-coming part of London. How much does that park cost? How much could be made by turning that into houses or offices? And so this is the challenge that existing cities face, is how to incorporate sufficiently sized areas of green and blue space within an existing urban environment. So I'm going to spend the rest of my presentation, however long I've got, looking at benefits of blue space, and presenting some recent results. So unlike green space, water bodies are typically smooth, and they produce water vapour via evaporation, and that can potentially disrupt the boundary layer effect. However, water has a high thermal capacity, and it has an emissivity of about 1 temperatures you'll find in the urban area. So it's highly emitting and highly absorbing of thermal radiation. So what we find is that poorly sized water bodies might not alleviate the urban heat island, but instead create ground level moisture and increase radiant temperatures at night as they start to emit the heat that has been stored during the day. So we've run a series of open foam simulations looking at sort of a stylized urban area with a variety of different water bodies within it to try and solve this problem. So I apologise for the rather complex pictures. I blame my student. So in the top left, we have essentially a street canyon, an open square with no water body in it. And we can see wind passing over the surface has created this sort of laminar flow above, and then isolated air within the street canyon, and we get these sort of large vortices forming. So this is your canyon effect in your city. If we start putting in a water body, which you can just see as the dotted line, bottom images, the left-hand side images are for forced convection, so higher wind speed, and the right-hand side images are for mixed convection, so lower wind speeds. And the middle row is for a cooler water body, and the bottom row is for a warmer water body. So these could be proxies for different times of day. Because of the thermal inertia of the water, the cooler water body could be expected during daylight hours, while the warmer water body is sort of evening and nocturnal. So what we find is that the forced convection, the water vapour given off by water body cannot penetrate that skimming flow above. So all it is doing is contributing to humidity levels at street level. If we go to the more still weather, so the mixed convection, the cooler water body again is not able to penetrate the skimming flow. It's changed the vortices pattern within the street canyon as the water vapour spreads out across the streets, and it will spread horizontally through the city. Whereas or at night, when you've got the warmer water body, you can get this thermal plume drawing heat and pollutants away from the city surface. So the warmer water body will be giving off more water vapour per area, which means that it's able to penetrate the skimming flow. So if we look at some downwind street canyons here, so again, the top image is the baseline case with no water body, and the bottom image is for the warmer water body we just discussed. We can see that as the thermal plume exits our open square, it's also sucking air out from the adjacent street canyons as well. So a small water body in an urban area can have wide-reaching effects in terms of removing heat and pollutants from an area of city. So what about size? How big does this pond have to be? So the initial case we've just looked at, the water body had the same area, the same footprint area as the buildings, so buffer sediments. So we just had a nice uniform array, took out the building and put in a patch of water. If we start altering the size of that water body, making it smaller, at what point does it stop having an effect? So we've got different images here. We've got 1:1, so the case we've just looked at, and then reducing size, so half, quarter, 1/8, 1/16. We can see that the effects of this warmer water body reduces with the area pond, which you expect. But what it doesn't do is reduce the humidity within the street canyon. It's still producing water vapour. That water vapour is accumulating within the street canyon as opposed to dissipating vertically. So this is all for the warmer water body. In the case of a cooler water body, so during the day, no size of blue space is able to penetrate that skinning flow. So this is quite an interesting result because it means that we need to think quite carefully about where we're going to put lakes, how quickly these lakes are going to warm up. A very deep lake is going to have a lot more thermal inertia and it won't heat up or cool down as quickly. So you're going to have a longer period where the temperature is below external temperatures. So it might lag behind by a day or two. So in heat wave conditions, you might always have a cooler water body, even at night. And therefore, you're actually worsening thermal comfort conditions. And being predominantly naturally ventilated in the UK, that also means conditions within our buildings as well. So we need to think about how we can size our water bodies and our blue space. So some takeaway thoughts, and then I'm done before Prashant gets me off. Nature-based solutions have great potential to reduce the heat island and mitigate the effects of climate change. So if we can cool urban areas, we can offset the warming due to climate change. So this is of growing concern. But we do need a better understanding of how more diverse green spaces affect the boundary layer, how they enter sparkling sediments, and how the water vapour they give off can affect the boundary layer and the fluxes above. Water bodies may provide vertical transport of heat and pollutants, but only when the water is warmer than the air. If it is small or cooler, then you may have adverse effects. So we need to avoid cases where we're actually going to make situations in cities worse through poorly designed nature-based solutions. The situation under heatwave events, where you've got a more stable atmosphere, is also an ongoing case of research, with a paper hopefully being submitted today. So that would represent the worst case scenario with a stable atmosphere. And I'm done.
Hey, thank you, Tristan. This was a very interesting presentation and very well presented. If you have any questions for Tristan, could you please use the Q&A box and write those questions for him? I would like to now introduce our second speaker, Professor Fang Wang. She's come from the Institute of Soil Science, Chinese Academy of Sciences. She worked at Munich Technical University, Humboldt Munich Center, and Michigan State University. Her research focusing on soil pollution and remediation. She has published over 200 articles in reputed journals like the Innovation and Environmental Science and Technology. So she has been awarded the Alexander von Humboldt Fellow for experienced researcher from Germany, Shannon Young Talent from China, and Young Talent of Liu Ziazi from Chinese Academy of Sciences. She serves as co-editor-in-chief of Environmental Technology and Innovation, associate editor of the Science of the Total Environment, and the academic editor of the Innovation. So she has been having a number of roles and doing a fantastic job in the domain. So I would not take more time, rather pass it on to Professor Wang for her presentation.
Okay, thank you. Let me first share my slides. Hello, Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Kumar's invitation to give me this opportunity to share my work in the past few years. Today, I'd like to share work on soil environment and sustainable development. So actually, I'm a soil scientist, and then my work is mainly focused on the soil pollution and remediation, and especially for the organic pollutants, like the persistent organic pollutants and emerging contaminants. For the emerging contaminants, I mainly focus on the pesticides, either like which is related to microplastic, and also the antibiotic resistant gene, which is short as ARG. In terms of our network, so today I would like especially start with contaminated site in the city. Especially in China, we have many places they are contaminated when the factory they move outside the city, and then you have a lot of contaminated site, especially for the organic chemicals. So for this kind of sites, we have to remediate. So currently, I have a project which is for remediation of contaminated sites, especially for the soil, groundwater, and even the surface water. So for us, for the highly contaminated section, we try to use oxidation degradation of the chemicals, but for the relatively lower contamination of the soils, then we mainly use microbial degradation, which is more green and sustainable. So in the lab, we first try to select the degradation bacteria for degradation of the chemicals, and also to try to select the oxidation chemicals, for example, the ferrite and the sulfate, for later on applied in the field to understand why and how and what's the efficiency in the lab. And based on this, then when we work in the contaminated site, we try to use different combination of the bacteria to inject in the contaminated soil. And then also for the oxidation remediation of the contaminated soil, then this is more a large scale. We have to this way cooperate with the company to do the work to ingest the oxidant agent into the soil and the groundwater, and then to degrade the organic chemicals in the soil. And later on, and then this remediated soil, which could be safely used for either construct of the buildings or later on for the public park. So another topic I would like to share is about plastic. I think this is also a very big issue for all over the world for the microplastics. In China, we have especially the problem because we have a large amount of greenhouse, use a lot of fumes, and then the chemicals in the fume might release and then menace the human health. So I collect the data, the published data all over the world, and then calculate the point. Actually, the chemicals pacillate acid ethers, short as PAs, it's a little bit higher. Basically, it's a little bit higher in China than other countries, for example, the Netherlands, Denmark, and then UK, and so on. So then how the chemical release, then we use the catalytic experiment, find the chemicals released from the fume. It follows the first catalytic order, and then for the different greenhouse, we calculate the risk values, and then based on this, we recommend the government to choose different types of the fume, and also for those are more safe, could be recommended to the farmers to use. And then for the fumes and then plastics that goes into the environment, they might break down into small pieces, especially microplastic. They could be charged either positive one or negative one. So how they behave in the soil, we find for both kinds of plastics, they could physically trapped by the soil particles, but for the positive charged one, they is mainly charged is a positive charge, so it's mainly trapped by the electrostatic attraction. But for the positively one, it's mainly due to the electrostatic repulsion. And for both type of plastic, the wet wall force also play a role for the absorption of the plastic and the soil particle, and then influence their fate in the soil environment. And then when the plants grow in the soil with microplastic, how this could affect the plant cells. So we find we test and find the microplastic they could move from the root to the leaf, especially accumulate into the leaf veins, and then will change they change the plants, especially for increase anti-stress genes and then decrease iron homeostasis related genes. And then this is from the root. How about the microplastic in the air when they deposit on the leaf plant, especially on the leaf? So we also test, and then we find for the different positive plastic, the positive plastic microplastic is more easily transferred from the surface of the plant leaf into the leaf tissue through the stamina or the cortical pathway, and then more positively charged microplastic will induce higher gene expression, and then also induce higher damage or side effect to the plant. So in the environment, we have not only microplastic and also chemicals, and at the moment we are mainly focused on how this contamination of the pollutants transfer in the soil, especially through the food chain to human, to influence the human health. And the other topic I would like to share is about the antibiotic resistant gene, short as ARG. So because of antibiotics, we use a lot for in the former time for the animal production, and also, of course, also for the human being. And then this caused the resistant gene contamination all over the world, especially when the superbug. Because of the superbug, if the people is infected and then they couldn't find any antibiotics to treat, then we cause their death. So this is a big issue all over the world. For this, we first to understand the risk of the ARG in the environment, we need to know the background of the ARG. So we choose Antarctic, which has minimal human influence. And then even in the Antarctic soil, we find many ARGs. However, its relative abundance and detected gene numbers is much lower compared to other environment sets. And then when we have higher or strong human influence, how it could influence the environment. So we look at a long-term application of manure into the soil to look at the soil antibiotic resistance. Because the manure is the main pathway transfer from the human or animal to the environment. And we see even after long-term application of manure, the accumulation of the ARG in the soil is not really strongly increased, but we do see a little bit increase. And then the dry land has even stronger effect compared to the paddy field. And then for the human health, it's more direct is when the plant, especially we tried the carrot, which is a worldwide salad, and also directly grow in the soil to see how the ARG transmit from the soil into the plant. It's obvious, we can see the ARG in the manure did transfer from the soil to the carrot, especially on the screen of carrot. but still some of the gene could transfer from the skin into the inner tuber. So to reduce human health, we would suggest to peel the carrot before if the carrot is grow in the highly manured soil. This is a culture in China. People like to peel before eat the carrot, but this is different culture for the European or American people. So for the allergy to tackle this problem, we need to work with the environment, human being, and also animal section. And of course, the soil is a key component because soil is not only a sink of the air, but it's also a source of the energy. So we are trying to understand how the energy transfer from the soil through the food chain to human being. And then we are trying to reduce this transmission during the food production system, because during food production, the energy will transfer from the animal, human, to the food, and then back to the human through the food chain. And then in the city, well, we have a lot of waste, and also, of course, in the agriculture field also. So this waste will cause air pollution and also soil water pollution, as well as to produce a lot of greenhouse gas emission. Then how to catch this? For us, we try to use the waste to produce the biochar, and then to reduce this greenhouse effect, and also to use for the soil remediation. Of course, for these slides is from not from the work is not done by myself, but it's linked to our slides work. So I also mentioned here the biochar even used in the green wall, and also in urban landscape, and treat with water, and even biochar mixed with aggregates to build the street. So for me, my work is mainly use the biochar to reduce the soil pollution. And then for not only the organic chemicals, because with the biochar it will absorb the organic pollutants and reduce its bioavailability to plant or animal, and the risk could reduce the human, even the human health risk. And in the meanwhile, we also use the biochar with synthesized with the quaternary phosphorium salt, and to kill the bacteria, especially for the pathogen and also the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This because in the wastewater, the pathogen and also antibiotic-resistant bacteria at the moment is still a big issue for the wastewater treatment, and even they are used in agricultural irrigation. So then we use this technique could easily reduce this contamination through, because the material could absorb on the bacteria or DNA through the electrolytic absorption, and later on they could oxidize the bacterial cell, and even to oxidize the DNA, and then break down the cells and the DNA, and then to remove the ARG contamination. So for this material, we also tried to apply on the vegetables, which is manured vegetables, and then the results also showed that it could significantly reduce the ARGs, especially for the human pathogens, and the rush to keep the vegetables more safer. And then in the soil environment, we not only have antibiotic resistance, but we also have the heavy metal contamination. And then for this one, we use biochar combined with a hyper accumulator because the hyperaccumulator could accumulate the metals, for example, cadmium, and then remove the cadmium from this contaminated soil, and then the biochar could absorb the antibiotics and then reduce the selection pressure, and thus reduce the AR in the soil and in the plant. So based on our work, we propose to use the integrated biochar bacteria and plants for the sustainable remediation of contaminated soil. And then based on work, we are invited to write a big review paper on the technology and the perspectives for achieving carbon neutrality. In this paper, it's about 40 scientists from 9 countries, and then it also includes not only the carbon-based technique to biochar-based technique to mitigate the carbon emission and for the bioremediation for the remediation of contaminated soil. It also includes the green energy section and also carbon capture and utilizing section, and also for the whole ecosystem, for example, terrestrial system, marine ecosystem, and agricultural food system for how those technologies for achieving carbon neutrality. This paper is published in the Innovation and it has been cited for more than 400 times. And this year, we are also invited to write a paper about climate change strategy for mitigation and adaptation. This, of course, Professor Kumar is also involved in this paper. So this paper is published in the Innovation Geoscience. It also has how it shows how the climate change, the drivers, its effects, and then we mainly focus on the mitigation and adaptation strategies. For my talk, I may stop here, but I will take the opportunity to promote my journal, the Environmental Technology and Innovation. This is on Q1 journal, and at the moment we are recruitment associate editor, editorial board member, and also youngest editor. If you're interested, please send a letter to our email. And also, I would like to also promote our journal, The Innovation. This is a self-press partner journal. This year we received the first impact factor of 32, which is ranked right after Science and Nature for the multidisciplinary journal. At the moment, we have not only the innovation, we also have the more specific, the innovation life, geoscience, materials, medicine. So you're welcome to submit your manuscript, and we are calling for young editor. If you're interested, please also send your CV to our email address. So finally, I would like to thank my group members for their hard work, and also thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Wang. This is a very well presented topic. It's a very important topic as well, so you did a fantastic job to summarize the complexity of the area in 20 minutes. I'm going to pass on now to my colleague, Dr. Nerea, for chairing the Q&A session.
Thank you, Prashant, and thank you, Tristan and Professor Wang, for your amazing presentations. The first question we have in the chat is from Felicity Harris, and I believe it's for Tristan, but I think it also can be answered by Professor Wang. So Felicity Harris says, how can a city that is adopting a greening and nature-based solutions approach make the right decisions? Should we exercise caution and wait until more evidence emerges? can cities model possible options? For example, which lakes to choose best? Case scenarios. Which lakes to choose as best case scenarios? Do you think the recent focus on tree planting within cities may create problems going forward?
There's a lot of questions in there. Right. Let's start at the top, shall we? I think with any form of nature-based solution, bigger probably is better. But there are obviously downsides largely associated with cost and the drive for densification of cities that also need to be taken into account. In the case of, say, lakes, bigger would be better, provided it is suitably shallow, so that it can still warm up relatively quickly. Otherwise, you'll have the trouble of unable to break through the skimming layer and increased humidity. Can cities model possible options? They can. Whether they will is open to interpretation. Models have been available for several decades, but don't seem to get much use. What we're hoping to do, me and my students, they're being dragged along, is to hopefully derive a set of rules, if you like. So look at the type of city, how rough is the city, how big are the buildings, and then prioritise the best forms of green and blue space for those types of situation. So that's a work in progress at the moment. Do I think that recent focus on tree planting within cities is going to create problems? I think an avenue of trees is absolutely fine because there are gaps between them. If you have a dense canopy of trees, you can get air pollution issues where it gets trapped beneath the tree canopy. But lone trees, they're not going to do anything really in terms of surface roughness, but they do promote shading of buildings and hence storage of heat. So they're a good thing. So no, I don't think they're going to cause problems. As long as they stay alive and get watered.
Professor Wang, would you like to answer the question or some of it?
I think Jane already had a very good answer.
Perfect. Maybe I could ask a follow-up question because I was wondering whether the state of pollution of the soils might have an effect on the benefits or not of planting, for example, or of the construction of large bodies of water. Like, what if the pollution of the soil is not taken into consideration enough? Would that damage substantially the benefits? Like, how would you see the balancing of those different co-benefits, the reduction of heat island effects versus the quality of soil?
Thanks for the very good question. Actually, so for example, in China, actually we have cases like that's many years ago. So we don't have very good law at that moment. And then so for the contaminated site, and then they have the investigation, but the results is not well done because of the methodology not very scientific. So then they think the soil is safe, so they construct a lot of buildings, and then the apartments they are all sold. The later the citizen has the problem because there's still contaminants in the soil under the ground. So then so this is a big problem because then all the people has to move out and then have to reduce the remediation of the contaminated site. So I think to keep the safe is the first. The second is for remediate the contaminated soil is very costly. needs a lot of money. So now in China, the case is we need to balance better whether this will use for the human, the citizen, or will change to a park or just a forest without any people go there, and then to leave the contaminated soil, how to say, to remediate itself, because the chemicals will degrade naturally and slowly. So this also depends on the city's, how to say, the future, the plan of the city, and then for, of course, for the human health is the first, is on the top.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have that much time left, and I believe Prashant wanted to have a few last words. Hello, Prashant. Well,
hello. Sorry, yeah, I got onto the mute. Yeah, so thank you very much. I think we should thank all our speakers for the fantastic talk, and thank you very much, Nerea, for sharing this session. So before we close, I would like to advertise the new webinars, the next webinar. There's going to be webinar 17 on 4th of October between 12:30 and 13:30. We got two very interesting speakers talking about the water quality and the greening the high street. So this should be definitely an interesting topic. Before I close, could I also take your attention to the Reclaim Network Conference, which is coming up on 11th of September. So if you haven't registered yet, so there's a link in the chat box. Please feel free to register, so there is no cost associated with it. And if you are not a member of the network, then there is another link here where you can register yourself, and you will start getting the updates. But if you have any questions or any you want to be a speaker, then please write to us on info@reclaim-network.org. So with that, again, I would like to thank all the speakers, our chair, and also our the colleagues, Mark and Sarah, behind the scenes, making this conference happen. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you in the next webinar.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.